watching World Insight with me, Tian. Still to come on our program. Victory over ISIL, too little too soon. A Washington insider talks about U.S. policy decisions in Syria and many more right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian. The program is coming to you live on CGTN. Last month, U.S.-backed forces declared victory over ISIL in Syria. Yet the terrorist group is still making headlines. On Thursday, ISIL claimed its first ever attack in the Democratic Republic of Congo. A research is underway for some ISIL hostages, and that leaves governments around the world with a decision on what to do with them and with people who became ISIL members, but now want to return home. Earlier, I talked to Brett McGurk, who is served as special presidential envoy for the global coalition to defeat ISIL at the U.S. Department of State. He famously quit that job when President Trump announced a U.S. troop withdrawal from Syria last December. He spoke to me as senior fellow for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Here's what he has to say. Mr. McGurk, what a pleasure to see you on CGTN.
So glad to be here. Thank you.
You've been working instrumentally over the years to defeat ISIL, but the question really for you, and I guess a legitimate one, is ISIL really being defeated already?
Well, you know, it's a big question. You go back to where the situation was in 2014, and ISIS, we call them ISIS, was controlling territory with 8 million people under its domain. Really incredible to think about. They had revenues of $1 billion a year, the largest terrorist organization we'd ever seen. Over 40,000 people from all around the world traveled into Syria to join this terrorist organization, including from here in China. So this was just a huge international problem. So the United States of America did what we can really uniquely do. We built an largest international coalition in history. We worked very closely, of course, with our partners in Iraq and on the ground in Syria to take back what used to be called the physical caliphate. So as of now, ISIS no longer controls any territory. I think that's a very significant achievement.
But you know, it's very hard now to deal with the current situation, isn't it? As you said, many of them are being imprisoned, but what to do with them?
So the first objective is to have these countries take back their people.
How far are we
President
from
Trump
those
has tweeted about that. He said that that should happen. Of course, that's very difficult. Some American citizens, or people who claim to be American citizens, want to come back to the United States. That's very unlikely to happen. So it's a big problem. Of these tens of thousands of people, you have to figure out who they are, sort them out, where they're from, who's a really hardline indoctrinated person, who might not be. And so this is all being worked through now, but it's going to require, again, international cooperation. I'll say one thing. The UN Security Council passed a resolution and a mandate for an entity in Iraq called UNITAD, and what this is about making sure that, really for history, the United Nations and international experts document these terrible crimes of ISIS. They document the genocide. They document what actually happened. So there's a historical record. And then they also hold people accountable. And UNITAD's mandate is focused to Iraq. I think it might be a good thing if their mandate was extended to Syria, because it's a very serious problem right now in northeast Syria.
Who will provide leadership beside the United Nations? Of course, that is an international organization, but key players within the organization has to play an instrumental role. And apparently, the U.S. is having its what they consider as withdrawing role from the region rather than more engagement. So what do you make of the current situation? What role will U.S. play?
Well, first, look, I think our leadership role in the world remains unparalleled. So we, in the ISIS coalition, we built a coalition of 79 partners, 75 countries and 4 international organizations. I think that is almost unprecedented in history. So American leadership will be quite critical, but you know, we can't do this ourselves. We have to make sure that we have partners. Now, I hear this a lot, that the United States is kind of receding from the Middle East, and I would challenge that a little bit. I remember when we had 160,000 troops in Iraq, people thought that the United States role was kind of, we were doing too much in the Middle East. So this is always a balance of trying to get it right. I would just say, if you look at our military deployments in the Middle East, these are permanent long-term partnerships with Qatar, with UAE, of course with Bahrain, with Iraq. So these are long-term partnerships that are going to continue. Now, one thing that has changed, of course, is that the United States used to be very dependent upon the natural resources of the Middle East region. We no longer are because of our real breakthroughs in technology. We're now the world's largest oil producer. This is a fundamental change in the geostrategic equation of the world. That's a structural issue. That is, I think, one reason why people say the United States might be pulling back a little bit. I would say that we're rebalancing appropriate to circumstances.
160,000 American troops in the region, as you mentioned, sir, earlier. It's not necessarily all about fighting ISIL. Rather, there are some other options and objectives of those troops. So it's not necessarily proving a point, I have to point out, that the U.S. is doing its utmost to fight against ISIS even for now. Well, those receding from the region is not being said by the others, but rather said by various administration officials themselves right now sitting in the White House.
Well, again, I define receding. I think there's a debate in the United States about our overall level of investment around the world, making sure that we have a balanced investment so that we're very much invested here in this part of the world, and also we don't want to be over-invested in the Middle East. That's a rebalancing. But I would just, when I hear that the United States is totally receding from the Middle East, I just don't think that's really credible. And we have vital interests in the Middle East, and that's going to remain. I mean, the free flow of energy resources through the Straits of Hormuz and those very important waterways, that's something that we work on, obviously, with the U.S. Navy and our partners. We have fundamental economic investments throughout the region. We have cultural programs. We have educational exchanges. So I can go on and on. So the United States is very much engaged in the Middle East, and that's something that I'm sure will continue. So, again, it's a big challenge. It's going on right now in northeast Syria. That's one reason I think the U.S. Military forces should remain in Syria, at least for a period of time. I think that's very important because you can't just open up a vacuum, because we have these very difficult challenges, particularly with these young kids.
But now one has to argue that since the enormous geopolitical changes going on in the world, not just in the Middle East, and not just about ISIS, but also about other issues, that people's and the international community's attention has been shifting to the other issues rather than focus on the issue that you are very passionate about.
Well, I think it's positive that ISIS is not on the front pages all the time. We don't want that as citizens of the world. That was a really terrible period. We had attacks being carried out in the streets of Paris and the streets of Brussels. They were planning major attacks all around the world, including in the United States. So I think we've reduced the risk of that, which also gets it off the international headlines, so it's not front page news. I think that's understandable. But dealing with these challenges is very important. So that's one reason why the U.S. continues to lead this coalition. My successor, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, is continuing on that very important role to keep the spotlight on this problem. The fact that you asked me about it is very important. I'm all the way over here in Beijing, and you're asking me these very important questions about what to do with all these people who are in these detention facilities in Syria.
China and the United States, as you may know, are in negotiations, intense negotiations about trade and economic issues. People wonder whether there's only negativity of this relationship and potential Cold War, but others argue there are actually a lot of common grounds that the two countries can work together with the others around the world. To fight terrorism is one of them. How much do you think that relationship started from the Bush administration can continue and be sustainable under this administration and probably in the future, given the fact that there are changes taking place in the bilateral relations?
And I can't speak for President Trump or the Trump administration. I'm just
no,
in
you
my
can't,
private
but just
capacity,
from your
of course.
expertise, yes.
But I think, obviously, and you listen to the president, what he says, there are very serious concerns in the United States about certain actions that the Chinese government has taken in recent years. And I think, obviously, President Trump is standing up for American interests as he sees them, as he sees fit, and he was elected by the American people. I think he also wants to find some areas of convergence where we can find areas to work together. You know, through my trip here in Beijing this week, it's been very interesting. The focus has been China and the Middle East. And obviously, China is becoming much more invested in the Middle East. President Xi, with a very important speech which he gave in January 2016 before the Arab League in Cairo, kind of laid out the Chinese policy in the Middle East. that China will really doesn't see it as a sphere of influence, a lot of things. But actually, you look at the investments since then, almost $100 billion of investments. China is now a comprehensive strategic partner. That is the highest level of diplomatic status that China can bestow upon a country. Very interesting with Iran and Saudi Arabia, two geostrategic rivals in the region, and with UAE and Egypt. I think that's going to be very difficult to sustain because everything in the Middle East ultimately does come down to politics. There are major internecine issues which go back hundreds of years. So it's hard to just kind of remain astride those issues.
Talking about China's role in the Middle East and its potential cooperation with the region, the Belt and Road Initiative certainly is one of those that, if you ask many Chinese, would be on their mind. It's about so-called connectivity. And of course, the U.S. has a very different view about it so far. But the question really is, will building infrastructures, trying to create connectivity, from your perspective, sir, will be able to help at least some of the developing and emerging economies of the region to have a bigger exposure to the rest of the world, and therefore a potential better economic prospect? What do you say?
Well, we all want stability in the Middle East. It's a vital region of the world. So that's something I think that's obviously an objective that we share. I think there's serious questions about the Belt Road Initiative, about what the actual objectives are, what the goals are. I think there are questions for, again, these tensions that I think China's likely to find itself. For example, second largest trading partner with Israel, major infrastructure investments in Israel, and also a comprehensive strategic partner with Iran. I think those are the types of things. There's a tension there, which is going to play out, and that was part of my discussions here this week, trying to understand
how does that work?
How China intends to deal with that tension. In the Middle East, I think that's hard. So this will be a really critical issue here over the coming years. I think there might be areas in which the United States and China can work together on. There's also going to be areas in which we're going to be in a real competition as powers. I think that's almost inevitable.
China is on a learning curve. I mean, after all, this is a developing, emerging economy that has, for the very first time after many years, be able to have this economic capability to do investment and also to cooperate economically with many others. So whether that will also have to do with the way that it's going to function geopolitically, we're going to have to wait and see, as you said, with a lot of intellectual curiosity over there. On the other hand, if you talk about the potential cooperation with these countries, there are a lot of instability issues in the region. For example, the issue of Syria, with which the international community do not necessarily agree with one another as to whether Mr. Assad will play an instrumental role continually in the country. And there's also the issue of Iran. Six earlier parties, I guess, also have been agreeing toward a peace mechanism, but now the U.S. tend to withdraw from that possibility. So how do you think, given your rich experience in the region, that China and U.S. would be able to cooperate? Since earlier you talk about cooperation.
And cooperation is a big word. So the issue is where
together.
Where do interests converge? And then how do each country use their influence, access, comparative advantage to
where
try
do
to
you think is the potential area to have our interest, you know, to be shared?
I think resolving the Syrian civil war, the entire UN Security Council, including the permanent 5 members, which includes China and the United States, all voted on a roadmap in 2016 for how to resolve the Syrian civil war. It's a very simple formula. The Syrian government should get together with the opposition and agree on some constitutional amendments, constitutional reform, and then leading to an election for a new president and a new parliament, probably to happen in 2021. It can happen earlier. But in that resolution, which again China approved, it should be an election which all Syrians vote, including the entire diaspora of 8 million Syrians, an election that's overseen by the United Nations. This will take a lot of work. And the United States is very, I know, committed. I know the Trump administration is very committed to that formula. And I would hope that China, given its emerging role in the region, given its influence with the Assad regime, would help push the Assad regime in that direction. I think that would be something to both of our benefits, and hopefully that's something that China can do. What I hear...
But as you may know, it's not as simply as that, right? It's very much a proxy war that we have seen in Syria with not only international powers, but also regional powers have their own agenda and having an impact on the results so far.
Yeah, so Syria is probably one of the most complex regional challenges we've seen in decades. But it is now getting to the point in which it's never simple, but it's a little more simplified. You have in Syria, the proxy war has kind of really died down, and you have now really three main zones of influence in the country. We talked about northeast Syria. That's an area of U.S. influence with a force called the Syrian Democratic Forces, 60,000 Syrian fighters. They more or less have control over that third of Syria. In northwest Syria, you have opposition groups that are heavily influenced by Turkey, and in the rest of Syria, you have the Syrian government, heavily backed by, of course, Russia and Iran. And the situation now is basically in those three zones of influence. So actually, the table is being set for diplomacy.
Carrots and sticks has been a very successful practice the U.S. has been using over the years, with Iran as well, particularly about the Iran nuclear deal. As demonstrated earlier with the earlier two administrations. But now, of course, it's a disconnect from the earlier practices. But the question really is, how can you succeed?
Well, and let me put it this way. So right now, we don't have any diplomacy with Iran. I happen to be, as a diplomat, I happen to think diplomacy is a good tool to have in the toolkit. I think having open diplomatic channels is a good thing. One reason you build economic pressure is so that diplomatic efforts can succeed. I think the Iran nuclear deal was an example of that. But right now, we don't have any diplomatic ties with Iran. China does. China doesn't only have diplomatic inroads with Iran. China is a comprehensive strategic partner with Iran.
Are you concerned that I have to ask you about this, because it is not just China, it's also the European Union as well. The European countries are establishing companies that can directly deal with Iran, and it is totally against what the U.S. consider as the economic sanction, which others does not subscribe. So the question is not just about China. The question is about why is the U.S. so different from the others, and will that be a success or successful solution to the overall issue?
But there is a big question here, though, for China, because how does China use its influence in Tehran, for example? The tension we talked about. Again, China is the second largest trading partner with Israel. Iran is transferring missiles and technology into Syria, which is not about fighting terrorists, it's about threatening Israel. So I would hope that China, given its status and influence with Iran, could say to the Iranians, stop that. That is destabilizing in the region. That should really stop. But what I hear is that China's kind of neutral, taking a neutral position. We should be able to agree, United States and China, that Iran should not be transporting sophisticated weapons into Syria, which could threaten Israel, who's both the friends of ours. That raises the risk of an interstate war in the Middle East, which would destabilize everything. Nobody wants to see that. So again, these are questions upon which I think the U.S. and China have a lot of common interests.
The U.S. tend to withdraw from its own responsibilities and way of contact with Iran to have an impact on the country by asking others, why don't you do more? That's very interesting, because the United States has already disconnected with Iran politically, and now is questioning everybody else. Why didn't you engage more with Iran to have more influence? That's an interesting argument, is it? It's an interesting logic, as far as I understand.
I'm asking, given the theme of the conference that I was at here, is China's role in the Middle East, position in the Middle East. There's no question, it's a consensus among the officials I met, among the scholars, among the business community. China has increasing influence in the Middle East. It's the policy that has been set by President Xi in 2016. Very clear for everybody to see. So the question I'm just asking, as an observer, as an analyst, is how's China using that influence? And can it use it in a constructive way? So I would hope that it can use it in a constructive way, particularly with a problematic actor like Iran.
It has been a very interesting and also resourceful, I guess, conversation, if not debate, we're having right now. And policy debates like this should be taking place more frequently, I guess, also in public domain. I hope our audience is going to enjoy today's conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.